We acknowledge that we record this show on the land of the Pyramid people and pay our respects to their elders past and present. G'day everyone, g'day Liz, how are you?
I'm good.
Come down from Thursday yet?
Thursday? Oh, the football, yeah. Oh, that was a good game.
I love how your accent gets more bogan when you talk about football.
Yeah, it has to. Yeah. NRL Penrith, yay.
Thanks everyone for joining Liz and I whilst we play Minecraft and talk about the philosophical and scientific study of consciousness. Today is the first in what I guess we settled on calling the Consciousness 101 series, Liz?
Yep.
So the idea with this is that instead of the main series where we're looking at contemporary research, we'll look at some older work of the kinds of things that you're likely to, or that we think you should come across in a university subject on consciousness. Our hope is that this will be more accessible to those who don't have a background in the study of consciousness already, and that when we have enough episodes, that they'll help make the main series a bit more comprehensible.
But buyer beware, we are still talking about individual papers.
And of course, all of these papers exist within particular academic traditions, and so are responding to claims that were made previously. And so some of them won't be understandable in great depth as the very first thing that you read.
You've sort of got to hold on and go for the ride, and then slowly understanding in a deep way will come.
We've started in what we think is the obvious place with Nagel's 1974 article, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? This has been a historically influential piece in setting up how people think about the problem of explaining consciousness, and it's also given us one of the most influential definitions of consciousness. That said, coming back to it for the first time in a few years, Liz, I'm not sure what you think about this, but there are some parts of this paper that have not aged well, especially in regards to the philosophy of science aspects of the argument.
I actually disagree. I don't think they've aged poorly at all. I think they're showing their age, but there's nothing wrong with wrinkles.
So I guess I think there are some assumptions about the nature of science that were popular in the philosophy of science sort of at this time that we've moved on from. I wanted to start with where I think Nagel does well. Where I think Nagel does well is in elucidating some things that seem to be true about consciousness, at least to people within a particular set of Western traditions, based on nothing but having experiences. This is why we sometimes say Nagel's paper is about how consciousness seems and some problems that arise pre-theoretically. So that's a bit of a weird term. All we mean by pre-theoretically is before any research is done. But that makes it a good place to start, right?
Yes, I think it's always useful to start with our pre-theoretical take, because where else can you start? But also, as somebody coming new to the area, to get more clear on your assumptions so that you can then have them challenged by the data as we gain more data is really useful.
So I talked about the problem of explaining consciousness, but that's not the problem that Nagel starts with. He starts with something called the mind-body problem. So, Liz, what's the mind-body problem?
It's the problem of seeing how the mind can be physical, isn't it?
I don't think we need to necessarily express the mind-body problem in terms of physicality, although I think that is one way of doing it. I think the most general way of putting it is just what's the relationship between mind and body. And this is a problem that has come from the Western philosophical tradition, and it has existed in that form at least since Plato. but it's something that's also heavily influenced by the West Asian monotheisms and their conception of a soul as independent substance, so a self that's separable entirely from the body.
So if you're going to be able to go to heaven after death, and it's going to still be you that goes to heaven after death, your mind must be able to survive independently of your body. But then your mind also controls your body. So how can it be part of you that is also separable and can go to heaven after death?
Yes. So we've already seen there's a few different ways of phrasing this problem depending on the kinds of assumptions that you bring to the table about what the mind is. So Nagel's going to raise a problem for a family of solutions to the mind-body problem. We've started throwing the labels around already, Liz, but this family of solutions gets labels like reductive or physicalist or materialist. So I guess, Liz, to get our head around what Nagel is criticising, we'd want to know what these views share. So what would you say these views have in common?
Okay, so what they have in common is the idea that the mind and body are in some sense not distinct, and that the mind just is the body.
It does get clearer the further we get into the paper, but early on, Nagel puts his concern like this, his concern about this family of solutions to the mind-body problem. He says, quote, "We have at present no conception of what an explanation of the physical nature of a mental phenomenon would be," end quote. And he asserts that consciousness is the really problematic part here. He says, again, this is a quote, "Most reductionist theories do not even try to explain it. It here being consciousness." Alright, so this is no longer true. There are many reductionist theories that do try to explain consciousness. But what is still relevant for us today is the stronger claim which comes next, which is this. Again, this is a quote, "No currently available concept of reduction is applicable to it being consciousness," end quote. Nagel's putting this very much in terms of reduction. So Liz, what is reduction?
So reduction, at the point in time when Nagel was writing it, and arguably still today, is about the relationships between our theories at different sort of levels of explanation. So it's a claim that we can translate our theories of high-level things into a theory of the lower-level thing. So, for example, that we can translate our theory of genetic inheritance into a theory in biochemical terms, and that we're able to do this via the identification of genes with DNA. It comes from the scientific successes in the 19th and 20th centuries, where we began to see how chemical bonding can be explained in quantum mechanical terms, or we began to see that lightning is electrical discharge. And it's the idea that we can get this reductive unity of our laws and concepts via an identity between the higher level things and the lower level things. And in particular, that we need to actually translate between our theories at the higher level and the lower level. And that this translation is enabled by these identities. So, for example, we identify genes with DNA, and then we're able to explain inheritance in terms of the ways in which DNA is copied into gametes, and then how the gametes combine to create a new organism. The key point is that we need to be able to translate between our theories, and that this translation is enabled by an identification of the higher level things with the lower level things.
This is where I think it's worth reflecting on the importance of, when we're reading these older papers, to read them in their historical context, because Nagel doesn't do a lot of work to say what he thinks reduction is. Perhaps because at the time it was fairly uncontroversially about this relationship between theories at different levels. Now, that's no longer the case. Reduction does come to mean different things to different theorists since then. But I think if we're reading Nagel in a 1974 context, we should read reduction in the narrow sense that you're talking about there, Liz.
Yeah, and even if you broaden it out, this ability to relate our concepts is still arguably crucial to distinguish between a position that is materialist from one that is dualist. I certainly agree that explicability in some sense is crucial.
So we introduced a new word there, Liz, in dualist. Perhaps we should just quickly say what that means.
Okay. So the dualist holds the opposite position to the materialist, that the mind is not physical and that the mind potentially can be separated from the body. I agree that the notion of reduction that Nagel is working with has gone through a lot of refinement since the publication of the paper. But what I would argue is that his central point, that you need to be able to relate the concepts in order to see how they can be physical, still holds. And I think that's the beauty of this paper.
So we have a sense of what Nagel thinks the problem is. Just as interesting here as the statement of the problems is the envisioned solutions. So he says, quote, "Perhaps a new theoretical form," he's talking here about reduction, "can be devised for the purpose. But such a solution, if it exists, lies in the distant intellectual future." End quote. So Nagel's not optimistic here at the start, but he is open to the importance of conceptual change, that is, of not relying only on our pre-theoretical concepts of, in this case, mind and body, and especially consciousness. He's claimed already that consciousness is the big part of this problem, of the mind-body problem, so he better tell us what he means by consciousness. So how about this, Liz? The fact that an organism has conscious experience at all means, basically, that there is something it is like to be that organism, and then later adds to it something it is like for the organism. End quote. So this is where the terminology something it is like enters into discussions of consciousness. I'm pretty sure for the first time, Liz, I don't know if you know of any earlier instances.
Not something I have looked into. Oh.
Did you die?
No, creeper.
That's much worse.
Yeah.
But I'd like us to notice, especially for those who have read some other work on consciousness, that the phrase "what it is like" is used a bit differently here than it is later on and in later papers that we'll discuss in this series. Whereas in future work it comes to refer to the qualities of experience, for example, the blueness of blue, the awfulness of pain. Here, something it is like is for an organism, something it is like to be an organism. So it's tied very strongly to the idea of a point of view. There's something it is like to have a point of view. Later writers, even those who are citing this paper directly, will depart from Nagel's use when they become less interested in point of view and more interested in the qualities of experience. So what do you think, Liz? Are these two different phenomena or two different issues?
Potentially. I mean, that's one of the major theoretical advancements that has occurred since Nagel wrote his paper, and arguably which occurred in response to Nagel's paper. But at the time of writing, Nagel was, I think, saying, look, if we're going to be able to explain consciousness, we need to be able to explain points of view.
Maybe even just drawing this distinction is offering some conceptual change.
For sure.
Yeah. So indeed, Nagel tends not to use terms like quality of experience or phenomenal character, terms that will become more popular in subsequent work. He says he's talking about the subjective character of experience. What is the subjective character of experience? It is the occurrence of consciousness to a subject, to someone. What's going to be important for Nagel here is not, for example, that blue is blue and not red, but that when there is an occurrence of blueness, it is an appearance to someone. Having set this up, Nagel now asserts his problem in a slightly different form. He says that any reductive analysis offered of mental phenomena are compatible with the absence of this subjective character. Ascribing functions or mental representations to explain behaviour, he asserts, can be done for people, but also for robots that do all the same things without them being conscious in his sense. So people who have read ahead will no doubt recognise this as a forerunner of what are sometimes called philosophical zombies, which are imagined creatures that are behaviourally indistinguishable from humans, but who lack experience. This idea is so underdeveloped, especially here, that it's hardly worth mentioning, except for what Nagel has buried in a footnote in response to this speculation. Because he says, quote, "Perhaps there could not actually be such robots. Perhaps anything complex enough to behave like a person would have experiences. But that, if true, is a fact which cannot be discovered merely by analysing the concept of experience." End quote. I think it's a shame for Nagel to hide this in a footnote, because he does return to this point in general form later in the paper. But here he is saying quite clearly that there are things about consciousness, in this case whether or not human cognitive and behavioural complexity is sufficient for consciousness, which are not knowable just by playing with our pre-theoretical concept. Some conceptual change will be necessary. This isn't Nagel's focus yet. For now, he's focused on the subjective character of experience. This is what he is worried is left out by this family of solutions to the mind-body problem, which he called variously reductive, materialist, and physicalist. For these solutions to the mind-body problem to be viable, they must be able to accommodate the subjective character of experience. Or, what's more directly relevant to our interests here, Liz, is the subjective character of consciousness must be explainable. So now we can turn to the bulk of Nagel's argument, where he will try to show that subjective character, what it's like to be a subject, is not the sort of thing that can be explained. For the same reason that, and I'll simplify and just use the term materialist rather than give the full list every time, solutions to the mind-body problem fail to accommodate the subjective character of experience. He says, quote, "But when we examine their subjective character, it seems that such a result, here giving a physical account of consciousness, is impossible. The reason is subjective phenomena is essentially connected with a single point of view, and it seems inevitable that an objective physical theory will abandon that point of view." End quote. To get our heads around Nagel's argument, we need to understand that for him, consciousness must have a point of view. He's now going to argue that the solutions to the mind-body problem he's criticising, and by implication the understanding of consciousness therein, leaves out the subject's point of view. Thus, they fail to be solutions to the mind-body problem or descriptions of consciousness. Consider the experiences of bats. The problem Nagel is going to raise is not specific to bats. He just thinks that bats are so different from us that it's easy to see why the issues arise. Nagel supposes that bats are conscious, that there is something it is like to be a bat. But it is extremely difficult for us to imagine a bat's point of view. Bats would seem to have sensory experiences that we cannot, or at least typically don't, those associated with echolocation. There is, he says, quote, no reason to suppose that it is subjectively like anything we can experience or imagine, end quote. How then are we to understand the point of view of a bat?
I don't know, but I would be curious to know what the point of view of the turtle that is stuck on top of my furnaces is.
Probably comfy.
Nice and
is warm. Yeah. So the tool available that Nagel considers, which is the pre-theoretical tool, is a kind of empathetic perspective taking. What if I use my experiences as a basis for imagining the bat's point of view? Well, this doesn't seem good enough. By using my own experiences, I can imagine what it is like for me to do bat things, but I can't extend from that to what it is like for the bat. He says, quote, yet if I try to imagine this, I am restricted to the resources of my own mind, and those resources are inadequate to the task. I cannot perform it either by imagining additions to my present experience, or by imagining segments gradually subtracted from it, or by imagining some combination of additions, subtractions, and modifications. End quote. It's not that we can do nothing in this regard. Nagel is happy to say that we can attribute types of experiences to bats. There's nothing wrong with saying bats experience pain, for example, or even that using sonar they can perceive objects in 3 dimensions in a particular direction. But we cannot conceive, so he says, the exact subjective character of this for the bat, from the bat's point of view. He puts his conclusions about this in a strong form. Quote, my realism about the subjective domain in all its forms implies a belief in the existence of facts beyond the reach of human concepts. End quote. There are facts about the subjective quality of experience that we cannot even conceptualize, let alone explain. Sorry, Liz, you wanted to come in there?
I was going to say, so I think it's worth just pausing for a moment and talking a little bit more about this claim, because I think it is fairly intuitive based on using our pre-theoretical concepts. So I know I've had lots of conversations about what it might be like to be a dog and to be able to experience so many more smells than we can, and what it would be like to navigate by smell. And so to be able to walk up to the spot and sniff and be able to smell that 6 different dogs have marked their territory, to be able to walk through a room and smell layers of things and navigate and find things based on those layers of smell. You can see as I begin to even try and talk about it how alien it is. Our concepts simply don't seem up to the job of talking about it.
If we wanted to do something like, say, well, maybe dogs associate identity with individual smells in the way that we associate identity with individual faces, assuming we don't have prosopagnosia, that maybe that's something that it's like for a dog to live in a smell world. But then if we do that, we're still just doing what Nagel is worried about, which is applying concepts from our experience and attributing that to the dog, rather than really inhabiting the dog's point of view.
I'm sure a lot of you are aware, dogs have been able to be trained to smell cancer. I can wrap my head around the idea that something smells bad or smells rotten. But it's mind-boggling to think of what it would be like to move around the world with a sense of smell that is so sensitive that you can smell cancer, given how overwhelming the rest of the smells are. I probably should bring it back to bats. So I started with dogs because at least we have a sense of smell, so it's not impossible to extrapolate from our experience to a richer experience. Bats are a whole other ballgame because they navigate via echolocation. So they make sounds and then they navigate by the waves that bounce back. What?
Yeah.
I've got... What? I release a squeak and then the echoes tell me where I am? It is just such an alien form of experience that it's hard to even think about how you would begin to understand it enough to explain it.
Mm. So Nagel doesn't spend a lot of time on this claim that there are some things which we can't even conceptualize, because that would take him too far from his key point, which is just that however we can currently conceptualize these things, or may be able to conceptualize them in the future, or some smarter being than us might conceptualize them, the important thing is that there are these facts which, quote, appear to be facts that embody a particular point of view, end quote. Now, we could read this as a point just about the alleged privacy of experience. This is a claim just that particular experiences are only had by one person and so are private. Nagel takes it that he is making a stronger claim, not merely about the accessibility of particular experiences, but of types of point of view. It's okay to say that beings who have sufficiently similar types of point of view can know the quality of each other's experience. But as the type of point of view diverges, as between human and bats, it becomes impossible. It's not clear exactly what criteria would mean we're sufficiently different, but having different kinds of sensory systems seems to be, for Nagel, a clear case. At any rate, it's fine if this boundary is fuzzy, so long as, for Nagel, we can identify some point of view that we can't occupy, as he thinks he has done using the example of bats. This then is the basis for his challenge to materialist solutions to the mind-body problem and the conception of consciousness therein. He says, quote, "For if the facts of experience, facts about what it is like for the experiencing organism, are accessible only from one point of view, then it is a mystery how the true character of experiences could be revealed in the physical operation of that organism. The latter is a domain of objective facts par excellence, the kind that can be observed and understood from many points of view and by individuals with differing perceptual systems." End quote. So now we're getting to the crux of the argument. The physical nature of the body is known objectively in the sense that it is accessible from multiple points of view. However, consciousness has this subjective character. It is accessible only from one point of view. There's a second argument which is added in here. Now, this can be a bit confusing because it also makes use of the terms subjective and objective. But instead of meaning these to refer to what's accessible to points of view, he's now talking about the appearance of phenomena to us being subjective and the nature of things in the world being objective. When we want to understand something, says Nagel, we move from a subjective understanding of it to an objective one. He gives the example of lightning. Liz, this is an example you used earlier as well. We start with the subjective appearance of lightning as a flash of light in the sky, something that's associated with storms and thunder, and move to an objective one, namely of electrical discharge. Another way of putting this is that we move from appearance to reality. But experience doesn't fit this pattern. How could we move from the appearance of an experience to the reality of it, or from a subjective to an objective description of it in this sense? You'll sometimes see this discussed as the idea that because consciousness is composed of appearances to the subject, to leave behind those appearances in favour of some other reality, some objective reality, is to leave behind the thing we're interested in, namely the experience. Nagel puts it this way, linking the argument back to the first one about points of view. Quote, if the subjective character of experience is fully comprehensible only from one point of view, then any shift to greater objectivity, that is, less attachment to a specific viewpoint, does not take us nearer the real nature of the phenomenon, it takes us further away from it. Put another way, this is still a quote, while we are right to leave this point of view aside in seeking a fuller understanding of the external world, we cannot ignore it permanently, since it is the essence of the internal world, and not merely a point of view on it. End quote.
If we think about other successful reductions or explanations that have shown us that lightning isn't some magical thing thrown by the gods, but is rather just electricity, what we've done is moved from how it appears to us to how it really is. We've moved from our point of view to the objective point of view that could be had by an organism that perceives the world via echolocation. They can appreciate that what happens when up in the clouds produces an electrical discharge, even if it doesn't appear bright and shiny to them.
The other thing that we're seeing here is why this paper is still read as setting up discussions of consciousness, and indeed is why we'd still use it for this series, rather than being only a contribution to the mind-body problem. Point of view is the essence of consciousness. Without the subject's point of view, consciousness doesn't exist. With it, it seems we can't have any objective understanding of consciousness. So how are we to approach the problem of consciousness so understood? Well, we've had some clues already, and now Nagel really gets to it. Quote, if we acknowledge that a physical theory of mind must account for the subjective character of experience, we must admit that no presently available conception gives us a clue how this could be done. End quote. In other words, there is something wrong with how we pre-theoretically conceptualize consciousness, or the physical body, or the relation between them. A lot of consciousness theorizing, we'll see as we move through the 101 series, can be understood as trying to improve this understanding. Because Nagel's argument is set up as an objection to this family of solutions to the mind-body problem, which we're calling materialist, which also gets labels like physicalist or reductionist, some people have read Nagel as objecting to materialism per se. And it's easy to do this because Nagel is rather cagey about what exactly these positions are. Because, like Liz introduced us to earlier, his focus is on a particular shared assumption of them rather than the details of the theories themselves.
I personally think that's a good thing, because he's sort of saying, look, the details don't matter. Before we get into the nitty-gritty details, we have to address this fundamental conceptual problem, that our pre-theoretical concept doesn't seem to fit into how we have shown that other things are physical. So the thing we've done to show other things are physical doesn't work for our pre-theoretical concept of consciousness.
So is Nagel saying that this whole family of views, whether they're just takes on the mind-body problem or theories of consciousness, are false? No, he's not. In fact, he's very careful to not say this, saying instead, quote, it would be truer to say that physicalism is a position we cannot understand because we do not at present have any conception of how it might be true. End quote. Specifically, we don't know how it could be true that mental states are body states. We don't know that on Nagel's pre-theoretical understanding of mental states because we don't know how we can represent the mental state that is consciousness, which is fundamentally subjective, in terms of the body, which is understood in objective terms. There were two arguments for this, using two different meanings of objective and subjective. Without knowing how to talk about mental states, specifically consciousness, in objective terms, we can't make sense of the identification between mental and bodily states, so we can't know, again, using Nagel's pre-theoretical concepts, if they are identical or not. The upshot for theories of consciousness, then, is that we'll want to know what sort of conceptual improvement they're offering over our pre-theoretical notions in order for us to know if mental states are indeed body states or not. He gives this as an analogy. Quote, for example, people are now told at an early age that all matter is really energy. But despite the fact that they know what is means, most of them never form a conception of what makes this claim true because they lack the theoretical background. End quote. Now, Liz, I don't know enough physics to know if this is true. It was taught to me as matter and energy being interchangeable rather than identical. But that's sort of the point, right? A good theory of matter-energy will tell us if that identity is true, just as a good theory of consciousness will tell us if mental states are body states or otherwise physical material states, depending on the terminology that you like or the specifics of your theory, or that they're reductively explainable in terms of body states if you prefer that sort of epistemic take. There are a lot of options to cover here, more than Nagel could have been aware of in the 1970s. Nagel was aware of arguments for materialism. Again, just take that as my shorthand for this family of views. He even acknowledges that some of them are good arguments. For example, he attributes to Davidson an argument to the effect that if mental states, including consciousness, are to have physical effects, then they should be describable in physical terms. So this kind of argument has been around at least since, I think it was Princess Elizabeth's responses to Descartes, although she didn't put it in terms of descriptions, instead aiming to discuss the metaphysics more directly. At any rate, to the extent that we think consciousness has physical effects, so for example, I drink because I feel thirsty, we have reason to think that mental states are also physical states. So if that example doesn't seem scientific enough, try that in binocular rivalry experiments that we talked about on our last main series episode. Subjects say they see alternating images of a house and a face because they do see them.
I think it's really important to appreciate the tension we are faced with, and to understand that although there are these conceptual problems, there's also really good reasons to think that conscious minds are part of the physical causal nexus.
You'd agree, and Nagel is saying here that we have reason to think mental states are physical states, even though we don't pre-theoretically really understand that claim.
So he's laying down the gauntlet. On the one hand, wait a minute, consciousness doesn't seem to fit into how we explain things. But on the other hand, our explanation better show how it fits in, because there doesn't seem to be room for it if it doesn't fit in.
Yep. So we need new or revised concepts, more detailed understanding of consciousness than we can get just from having experiences and thinking about them. But from this, we can't draw any deep metaphysical conclusions.
This is why I'm quite a big fan of Nagel, because I think he, at least in this paper, is appropriately cautious in the conclusions he draws.
Then the problem that we're going to be interested in our Consciousness 101 series is, where do we start our study of consciousness? Nagel offers a suggestion based on his observation that understanding is generally a move towards greater objective representation of something. Quote, "Very little work has been done on the basic question, from which mention of the brain can be entirely omitted, whether any sense can be made of experiences having an objective character at all. Does it make sense, in other words, to ask what my experiences are really like, as opposed to how they appear to me?" End quote. Answers to this question we will see divide theories of consciousness, and this question can be used to see some of the conceptual changes different theories of consciousness will provide. So I'd like to close with this quote because I think it's the nicest statement of the work Nagel thinks should be done, much of which has been done since 1974 and is ongoing. Quote, "At present we are completely unequipped to think about the subjective character of experience without relying on the imagination, without taking up the point of view of the experiential subject. This should be regarded as a challenge to form new concepts and devise a new method, an objective phenomenology, not dependent on empathy or the imagination." Then a bit later, "Concepts alternative to those we learn in the first person may enable us to arrive at a kind of understanding even of our own experience which is denied us by the very ease of description and lack of distance that subjective concepts afford." End quote. So let's get on and see what sort of proposals are out there. Let's call it a day. Next time out we'll be talking more about quality spaces in our main series.